hunting the big woods, I'm not saying it's not any harder than any other place to hunt, but it's different. And it takes a long time to learn if you're not used to it. So it really takes a dedicated person to want to spend days and days of not seeing a single deer.
It's unforgiving form of deer hunting.
Yeah. And you feel like you know nothing a lot. Like my deer season this past year, I went like 4 days without seeing a single deer, and then the first deer I see is the buck I shot. So like it just happened in the last hour I had to hunt. So that's the nature of it. It's just putting in a lot of time and hopefully having it happen.
Lights, camera,
Follow the trail.
ready to shoot.
If you know where a deer's bedding and you know where he's eating, that deer should be dead.
If you're passive on a deer, what you're doing is you're teaching them.
I've got 30 bucks in the Michigan record book. Everyone but one has had at least one previous wound on his body. Some had as many as 4.
The Exodus Podcast, your source for all things whitetail.
For folks just kind of tuning in here, this is Beau. It's the last time I recorded was at the Harrisburg show. Probably, I want to say it was 3 years ago because we had that COVID year. Then I got Aaron. We just recorded yesterday with you, and he's helping at the booth. But for folks who don't know you, just go ahead and explain a little bit of who you are and what you're all about.
Yeah, so my name is Beau Martonik. I'm from Pennsylvania, so I've grown up here my whole life, northern Pennsylvania. Grew up hunting the big woods from my family. My family's really big into whitetail hunting and just obsessed with it. So from a young age, I really didn't have any other choice other than be walking in the woods year round and learning deer. So that was kind of like how I grew up in that environment, and I always thought that I was at a disadvantage to everybody else because I'd watch what's on TV or see anything, and I didn't have, crop fields or anything to hunt. But once I went off to college and learned that there wasn't as much public ground or private ground that has access to it everywhere, I realized how lucky I was to have what I had. And then, when I went out west and got to, experience elk hunting and everything, when I came back, I just looked at it differently. It's like, oh, this is more of like looking at it from an adventure aspect and just kind of hunting deer in their natural habitat and not worrying as much about, the biggest of the big deer and everything. And they're still to be found, but
Sure.
they're out there. It's just, it's a little bit different, but I really love that style of hunting. And that's kind of what I've cut my teeth doing. And I also love going out west and going to new places. That's one of my goals is like every year try to expand to a new place, whether it's for deer hunting or for Western hunting, big game, whatever it is, and just kind of keep, make myself more well-rounded hunter and more importantly, just seeing cool places. So
Sure. You hunted a bunch last year, a lot of different states. And
yeah,
I mean, first full-time year doing that. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I started the East Meets West Hunt podcast in 2018, and a lot of it was focused on helping people from the East plan hunts out West, or not even just out West, but the idea of going somewhere new. That was kind of the whole plan for it. And I, that's what I built everything on. And the reason why I did it was because I learned a lot from podcasts at that time when there wasn't, a ton. They were starting to pick up then. But I was like, selfishly, I could interview people that, knew a lot more than I did, and I could learn from them. But putting a headset on would hopefully help other people like that, how I was helped to be able to do that. And then as I, the whitetail side of things, that's the funny part is I didn't think anybody cared to hear about hunting in Pennsylvania. And I started just talking about it because that's just what I did. And it quickly became the most popular part of, I guess, what I'm doing and what people are interested in. So I've kind of shifted a little bit the podcast to both, the adventure style, still not getting away from that, but a lot more whitetail focused and not just the tips and tactics, but stories and the deer camp traditions and everything that kind of involves hunting in the Appalachian Mountain Range, basically.
And to your point, it's ironic to think that, since you grew up with that and you just didn't think people would be interested. I would argue that's probably one of the most highly sought after information in the whitetail realm right now. It's big unbroken tracts of habitat, like no matter where you're at. Yeah.
And that was something that I had no plans for. That was not in the books. It just kind of was like, okay, I learned that through time. And it was like, man, this is easy for me to talk about because this is the stuff that I do all the time. And just finding, cool people to be able to talk to about it. Some well-known, some not. And it's been cool. And I've even through the podcast, it's just changed to where I have, I'll have some guests on that I'll bring listeners. They submit stories all the time. What I have called Mountain Buck Monday, where I share success stories, and I'll get some really cool stories. And I'm like, you can tell when some people submit them, as far as like, man, they're putting in some effort. Like they've got some things figured out. I'd love to pick their brain and bring them on, and they think that's cool to be able to come on and share their stories and stuff. And it's fun. I like getting to do it. But to your point, yeah, last April, I went full time with the podcast and YouTube, as I'm kind of growing that realm as well, doing some scouting stuff there, a few hunting films, but mostly information based stuff is what I'm focusing on, educational.
I think when you're the local guy too, that's like the key, because everybody thinks they hunt in the hardest state, especially PA hunters. So they're like, oh, this is the local guy who's got the down low on the state, So I think that's always a good thing.
Yeah. Oh, that's what I got yesterday at the last couple of days at the Maven booth. It was like people coming up and being like, it helped me because they were right away. They're like, oh man, I listen to your podcast. I love it because I hunt in Pennsylvania. I hunt similar type stuff, and you're relatable from that aspect. And Pennsylvania does have, the most hunters in the U.S., so that definitely helps.
Yeah. Have you seen influx of hunters where you're at over the last couple of years, or has it been pretty steady?
Here and there, some spots go hot, some hot with hunters, some do not. But like, I wouldn't say that. I was kind of concerned about that, talking about like the types of areas that I hunt, and now I don't give out specifics or anything. But I think it applies. Like where I hunt isn't anything special. It's applied across the board for really any big woods type areas. So I haven't seen a lot of it, and also the fact that hunting the big woods, I'm not saying it's not any harder than any other place to hunt, but it's different. It takes a long time to learn if you're not used to it. So it really takes a dedicated person to want to spend days and days of not seeing a single deer.
It's unforgiving form of deer hunting.
Yeah. And you feel like nothing a lot. And I've done it my whole life, and there's a lot of days where I'm like, I know nothing about this, because it's like my deer season this past year. I went like 4 days without seeing a single deer, and then the first deer I see is a buck I shot. So like it just happened in the last hour I had to hunt. So that's the nature of it. It's just putting in a lot of time and hopefully having it happen. But yeah, again, back to your point, was I've seen some influx in places, but still nothing crazy.
How do you, in those situations too, like how do you have the mental fortitude or confidence that you are doing the right thing? I think a lot of people start questioning what the heck are they doing after 4 days and not seeing deer. And I know that's relative across the country. Like that might be normal where you're at, but
but even though that it is somewhat normal to have that, it still doesn't make it any easier in your head. And for me, it's like I really rely heavily on having a hunt plan ahead of time, where I have places and historical data. And now I'm big on historical data, but there's years like this year where historical data can burn you if you don't pay attention to the other conditions, when there's absolutely no other food other than browse. Where some of the areas I hunt are like that, but they'll have, beech nuts some years, some black cherries, maybe some areas with oaks will have acorns. But when you have none of that and everything changes, like sometimes you got to throw the historical patterns out the window and kind of adjust. And that's what I learned this year. I was hunting off historical patterns. I'm like, last 2 years, I have data that this buck I was hunting is going to come through here at some point. And I checked my cameras. I didn't even have a doe in the whole month of October, and I was still hunting there. And I was like, all right, at some point I got to pull the plug. And that's what I did. And I ended up shooting a buck when I went 20 miles to a completely different area. And then I just pulled these cameras last week, and the area got hot, but it was 2.5 weeks later than it typically was. It was the week leading up to our gun season. The buck I've been hunting for 3 years was all over it. The day before gun season, grunting his face off, tongue hanging out. He got killed that weekend.
Man.
So those killed him. But anyways, it was just an off year, so it was kind of.
What do you think pushed that activity back a week? Was it just the weather, or was it?
I don't know. I have a couple theories on. I mean, I think the weather had a big impact on it. But the thing was, I didn't even have much nighttime activity during hot weather, which and a lot of times I do. When it's the rut, like in 2020, I think we had a similar rut. Yeah. And I had a lot of nighttime activity, where this year I didn't even have that. Like I wasn't even getting mature bucks on camera in some of these spots. And I still haven't completely put all the pieces of the puzzle together. I think this spring, as I get out and really walk all of these areas, I might be able to figure out a little bit more. But it was an interesting was a really interesting year. The weather had, I think, a big play on it. There was also that area had some increased hunting pressure that came in. There was some new logging that went on, so I think it shifted a little bit, some things. But yeah,
Do you think that the drought had any effect to how the deer reacted or acted this year?
I think so. I mean, I think a lot of the browse browned up quicker than it. Like in the fall, there was stuff that would normally be green longer turn brown earlier, and that seemed to me had a play in it. And then once I went back to my old trusty crick bottoms, that's where I ended up killing a deer, and that's where I had the most camera activity when I went back and looked at it too. And some of the darker timber and the hemlocks, and then in the bottoms. So it was the tops were just like dead, and in a lot of the places that I was specifically hunting, and it was dry during the summer. It was dry during the fall. You know, it was a different year for sure.
So when you relocated 20 miles, was that an area you had pre-scouted already, or were you just kind of on the fly?
So that was actually a very, very historical spot, like a place I've hunted for 15 years. The same scrape has been there forever.
That's
Actually,
cool.
the one tree got hit by lightning and blew over, and they turned the community scrape to the other one that's next to it. And like, I'm talking like the scrape, for anyone that's watching, you can't really see it, but there's this giant rug here. It's like that big underneath hemlock branches and like 6, 7, 8 licking branches. It's just like one of those spots. And it was in a hub. So like you had some different points up here that kind of came down. I wouldn't really call it like a quote unquote thermal hub, because it wasn't like that steep a terrain that came down to it, but everything ran to that point.
Sure.
And so I went in there, and that's the only spot that I had a pre-hung stand every year. Put one there because it's just good. And so both my dad and I, that's the only place that we share as a hunting spot together. So that was kind of funny. So I went in there, and it's like right on the edge of the stream. So you go up, and even though you get some swirling winds, and it was a high wind day, and I don't like to hunt bottoms on high wind days. Right before dark, it always settles down. The wind seems to calm down. And at first I was like, it was blowing all over the place. And I stayed in there because it's not like they're not bedding right there. It's a travel area. So then as it settled down, my wind started going right down the creek. That buck came, quote unquote, downwind of me. He came in, but he was just off enough where the wind was different where he was at. And I used some blind grunting, and he came just sprinting right up the bottom.
And you're using the creeks to manage your thermals too, right?
Yeah. I sit right over top of them a lot of times.
Yeah, because
right
it'll
on the
suck
bank.
it right down the way the creek's going.
Yeah, I use that a lot when I'm hunting the bottoms, because I know a lot of people don't like hunting bottoms because it can be squirrely as far as the wind, and it still can be even doing that. Yeah, just because it makes sense that thermals are going to pull down, but that doesn't always happen. Wind can do a lot of weird things that I can't explain, but it's worth it to me, especially during like the rut time period where they're not living right there. That I'll risk it. Sometimes you do get caught, but it's like for me, I'm not going to have, I never have a consistent wind all day hunting in the mountains. So that's kind of my thought process.
Especially when the foliage is on the trees, you really never have a consistent wind.
No.
Now, when you're hunting the bottoms like that, are you staying away from ones that are really like a really tight valley? Or are you trying to hunt like a wider bottom?
Yeah, I like wider bottoms, because the tighter ones, you got the wind kind of coming down on each side, and they hit, and it just creates this toilet bowl effect where if you get it wide enough, and especially if there's like I like grassy openings that will be in there, and that seems to help with that wind a little bit.
Yeah, I guess any opening you can get more consistency out of it then.
Yep, correct. So that's why I like to do that, and it always tends to be on those openings. Or typically in the Pennsylvania type woods is like a hemlock or some sort of conifer that's there, and that's where they love to scrape. So that's kind of what I target in those bottoms.
When you talk about wind mapping a lot too, so when you're going into some of these areas, how are you wind mapping and taking notes on your phone on, the wind direction was this, the speed was this, and there was foliage on, and this is how it behaved, or is it just in your mental checklist or book?
I do both. I mean, if it's a area that I've known for a while, then I just kind of mental notes. But if it's a new spot, like in 2021, when I killed a deer opening day in a creek bottom, that was a spot I was in there 3 weeks before that, and looking at my camera data, that was the only camera that buck would pass through. I knew he lived in there, but that was the only one he would pass through in that trail, and I didn't even have data. I put the camera up that day, but the data was from last winter. But I thought early season, it was very similar where, there's no mast in that area other than beech nuts. So it was like, okay, there's a fresh logging cut. And that was kind of my theory from being there in the winter, all the tracks and coming off the hill and crossing to the other side of bed.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what kind of, when I got down there, I was like, how am I going to do this? I looked at my trail camera data and I went back, like looking at Weather Underground and looking at what the historical wind data was for those days that he'd come through there. And it was like, he wanted a west wind, or it seemed like he liked a west wind. And you actually got a pretty consistent, whatever the weather map said, it was pretty consistent in that bottom to doing that, because it was, I'd say it's wide enough that it would just go west, I guess is the way to put it, or southwest. That was what he liked. But I was like, how can I hunt this? Because that's the direction he's coming. It's almost like right in his face.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I went down and I was just taking milkweed and throwing it from different locations and trees that looked good to be able to hunt it. And I found one tree that was on the bank that it was like, I'd throw milkweed and it'd be like, it's kind of float for a second and then it just swooped down the stream. So, and at that point, I marked all the notes. I put it in the journaling feature in Spartan Forge, because if I put it on a waypoint, a lot of times I lose track of where those notes are or what it is, where this is something I can go back and look at, and it logs all the weather data for me right there for whatever day I mark the stuff. And then I can go back and refer to it. But yeah, I'm big on logging that data. And then this time of the year, so in the winter time, is when I'm really going back through all of it. And then I'll tend to do like a checkup as far as right before season and kind of refreshing my mind on some of those things. But I take it and then I build that into what I call a hunt plan of like spots that I like to hunt. I write all the notes down and kind of keep it categorized by, what type of wind direction that the Weather Channel is going to say is going to happen. Which ones of those can I hunt really based off? It might not be, even calls a west wind. Some of these spots, maybe it's the wind's going to act differently, but I have trees picked out. So, but by having that hunt plan where I have, say, 5 to 7 spots for each wind direction available, when you're getting in that point, circling back to what you had said about like, how do you feel confident when you're kind of struggling there? It's like, this gives me kind of a strategic approach for like, okay, here are my options. Pick one of them and go to it and hunt and kind of just follow the plan. Because if you get in your own head, sometimes you'll feel like you have nothing, and I'm not saying that still doesn't happen for me, but it helps make the decision a little bit easier.
Yeah.
Well, this is the second buck in a row you shot in a bottom, right?
Yeah.
So you talked about having the wind just off, and I think that's something that people overlook all the time too, because of how comfortable it makes a deer feel.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something you always plan for, having the wind just off like that?
I wouldn't say I always plan for that. If possible, that would make sense. But especially in like the earlier and late seasons, the rut, I don't really worry as much about that. But like during the early and October and even in late season, I'd rather have something that's just off. And and I'd say more times than not that screws me. But if it works, it's like you can call better, you can draw your bow better. Yeah.
Like you just seem to you fool them so much better, and people think that you need to have the wind like completely in your favor, and maybe that might be important for access when you're making noise or setting up your stand or something like that. But
no, most definitely.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. One thing, a lot of people are postseason scouting, but in addition to that, they're likely pulling cameras and taking those precious SD cards, like the one you talked about, where it's been on a mock scrape or a community scrape all year.
Yeah,
with all the skunks.
So you get a pile of SD cards. Now what?
Yeah, okay. That's a great question. So so what I always do is like when I'll go in, like so a lot of these cameras I'll check throughout the year, but I tend, SD cards are so big now that I just put them back in. Like I'll look at them on my phone. I'll transfer any big buck pictures to my phone, to share with my friends and that kind of deal. And then I'll just put the SD card back in, and then I pull them all at the end of the year. And then I have this stack of SD cards. And it takes a long time to go through those. Now that I run most of my cameras on video mode, holy cow. And I've extended the video to, I like to do about 20 seconds is a pretty good. Longer than that, I'd love, but it takes too long and it eats so much SD card space that I'd rather not do that. But the 20 seconds seems to be a good middle ground for me. But anyways, I put it up on my computer and I transfer all the stuff over, everything, and right away I categorize it in folders. So I have folders going back to 2010 on my computer of spots. So I'll have it by year, and then I break it down by the bigger area. So X state forest or whatever. And then underneath that, I'll have, even more of a specific area, and then the specific spot. And this is when you start running a lot of cameras, it's hard to come up with names for side hill, community scrape.
That's exactly. I'm like Red Oak near fence.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at what is
West
that?
Side. I'll look at it. I'm like, I'm not sure where
Number
this is
3.
at.
What's number 3?
Yeah.
So I'm looking for a better way how to do that specific spot. The more cameras I start to run, but anyways, I do that, and then within there, I have the specific dates of the card pulls and have that in there to be able to look at. And I go through it, and I delete anything that's not pertinent. But I make sure I watch those videos from beginning to end. I can't tell you. I'd say one piece of advice is like, don't just look at it on your phone quickly or like scroll through the thumbnails because you miss so much. Like the one deer that I was hunting this year that ended up getting killed, there was on November 12th, I almost, went against my own rule and was just like, okay, I was going through so many cards. I was like, getting tired at that point. And I'm like, I watched it, and it was like the first 6 seconds of the video, there's nothing there. And all of a sudden, boom, he walks out in it. And I don't know if like based off of, it was using a lift too. So I'm not sure how you guys' cameras, if he detected them off before he even walked in or maybe a doe went through first. And
that's probably most likely. Yeah.
And he just comes in. I'm just like, holy cow. Like I almost deleted this video. So it's important to do that. But I don't always just keep buck pictures. So depending on the time of year, I'll keep doe pictures just as much as bucks, because that when I go back and look at that data, it's like, okay, there's does in this area around these dates. That's important to know, especially when you're focusing around the rut time period.
That was actually going to be my question. What time frame is that you're keeping pictures like that?
I'll start keeping doe pictures middle of October, say like the 13th on, basically. So that helps with like, okay, I know there's does in that area as bucks are going to start to check in a couple weeks. And that's why I keep that data. Now I'm not keeping every doe picture, but I'll keep, one or two from specific dates, and just knowing there's does there.
Right. Just kind of keep your memory in that. That's when it's getting hot.
Yep. So, cause doe groups are, in areas that I've hunted for a while, I pay attention to specific doe groups a lot and learning when they come into heat. Like there's a few spots that I know these doe groups. There's one that right around October 30th every year, Big Mama, she comes in and the bucks like to check her out around that time.
Yeah. And if you know where that bedding area is, I guess that's the doe bedding in specific in relation to that camera is the real important part.
Yes, correct. Yep. And I've learned that just from walking and bumping them multiple times. And that's where I've learned, not on purpose. It just happened that way. But it gave me that intel that I needed to know, like, okay, this is where does like to hang out at.
Yeah, I think that's something that most people overlook of not paying attention to doe pictures. People are just big buck.
Yeah.
And they have the pile of big buck pictures, but what's correlating? Why are they there?
Yeah. No. And then I have a separate spreadsheet, and now I have a separate spreadsheet where I take this data and then I put it into that spreadsheet based off of weather, based off of wind, based off of conditions. And I have like a general notes thing that has like, okay, seem to be coming from this direction. It was a major cold front, then I have like my own assumptions. Like maybe he was coming from this clear cut or he was coming from these oak trees, and I have that in there. But that is an overwhelming process, and like to go through that. So that's where I specifically look at a few bucks, and I only go that detailed on the data for only a few bucks, because otherwise it'd be a full-time job just trying to catalog all that stuff.
Have you had an instance where you did not initially identify a buck that was, let's say it was like a 2 or 3 year old.
Yeah.
And then a 4 or 5, like I want to try to kill this deer. And then you had the past data to go back and look through some of that stuff?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I'll go back through it, and then I'll start like recataloging it, because you can always find that historical weather information, in the past there. But that helps a lot. I mean, I've found trends with some of these deer that I think has been really, really helpful for that. So, but I will say again, like with data, and the more you start diving into it, you can really get paralysis by analysis bad if you don't. There's a lot of times where it's just like, I make a lot of just assumptions and just go off gut feeling versus having the data have to be perfect all the time.
Mm. Yeah, I mean that's a fine line and balance in itself that I think this takes time to nail down. I mean that's the simple of it. Now, how long is it taking you to do all this? Because it's pretty. I have the example of the spreadsheet in front of me, and when you're running, how many cameras do you run now?
I'm around 50, I think.
Yeah, it's so quantify the time a little bit.
A long time. I don't know how to put it in time. So I do it like I'll put it like this time of year. It's usually once or twice a week. Couple hours before I go to bed, I'll just like start going through, and I just do it over a couple month period of time. I'm not doing it all because it's
a
I mean,
lot.
I bet you have a whole work week full
Yeah,
time.
you can
and,
spend 3 hours on one card.
yeah,
sometimes.
yeah, I know. I did that the other night. I was like, it took me. I probably spent, when I said a couple hours, I probably spent 3.5 hours going through 3 cards that I had, and that's not even going through that many videos. Like,
Especially if in there are those doe bedding areas, you're like, it's pictures constantly.
yeah, and then I start going down rabbit holes of like, oh, then I'm looking at maps while I'm doing it, and trying to figure it out. But it's fun. It's just it's really time consuming. I was just talking to Shirk about it the other day because I'm going to meet up with him here shortly, and we're reviewing some of our data. We have some very similar trends that we found from this year that was just so off from any other year. But yeah, it's a time consuming process.
Are you guys recording a podcast on that?
Yeah.
I'll check that out.
Yeah,
It'll be good.
Yeah, he had reached out to me about it, and we were messaging back and forth, and yeah, I think we're gonna do that this week. So, but yeah, the data is a time consuming process. I'll put it that way. But I found so much value in it that it's worth doing for me, and it also helps like figure out my postseason scouting plan of like where am I gonna go into, what areas have some up and coming bucks, and
scouting with a purpose based off of last year's data.
Yeah,
I mean, essentially.
Exactly. And like for example, I was talking about hunting this one specific deer, and this is a rare example where like that was the only deer in there that was really worth that I wanted to shoot. And normally I go into a spot targeting one deer and I'll shoot another deer, and that's just the way I like to do it. But it gives me focus when I can hunt one deer and still shoot something else. Like, but this one, I don't know what happened, but the quality went down except for him, and then he got whacked. So it might be a couple years before I go back in there again.
I recorded with Josh Raley the other day from How to Hunt Deer, and he asked me like how you're when you do your postseason scouting, how you're relating the sign to hunt like a whole year. So when you get there, like all the sign that you're going to have through the entire fall's there, and how do you decide like, oh, this is early season sign, this is late season, this is pre-rut, mid-October kind of stuff. How are you deciphering all that sign?
So I like to scout with a purpose, like with a season in mind versus just kind of like general stuff. So like typically, especially when I'm going to a new area, I typically focus on like pre-rut, rut signs. So like that's what my main focus is. And then once I really dive into an area and I learn it for a while, then I start branching out a little bit. Because normally the first year or two, I don't even hunt the areas that I'm scouting. I'll run cameras, and that helps tell me more because sometimes it's tough to say like, oh, this is early season sign, or this is, that sign's tough to be able to tell, especially like rubs and other things like that. It's you can tell a little bit based off of how fresh they look, but I don't examine it to that level of detail. I kind of let cameras tell me a lot of that, like as I go through the years and be able to focus on it. But I typically am focused around rut and pre-rut time because that's historically when I've had the most time to be able to hunt. So that's when I kind of focus that sign on it. And then as far as like early season stuff, that's when I'm, going in August and checking out what the mass is going to be, or checking out the apple trees, making sure they didn't all have a late frost in May and they're gone, or checking the oak trees at that point. Usually it's actually like early September before I can really see the acorns up in the trees. Right. But kind of checking out that stuff, and that helps me relate a little bit more for
to make a whole season plan.
Plan. Yeah.
I know. I just a quick question in regard to when you're hanging those cameras in the summer, where are some of those locations that you're hanging in those kind of scouting areas you're not necessarily going to hunt that year?
Yeah. So that's I like to have like, especially a first year into a spot and I'm going in, I like to cover when you have terrain, I like to cover different terrain, like the tops, somewhere in the mid level, somewhere in the bottom at a minimum, just to make it simple. Is like I want to have a camera in the bottom, I want to have one somewhere on the side hill and somewhere on the top, because I don't know at that point what the mass crop's going to look like. I don't know what any of that's going to be. And if I had everything on the top on these hot scrapes that I found, in the spring, then and there's no acorns up there, but down low there's a bunch of beech nuts and there's cherries down there. Like those deer might not be up there at all this following year. So I like to have it kind of spread. And then as I check them and I go in, then I'm like, okay, I start saying, oh, this one on the side hill is really hot. Why? And then you start seeing, okay, is there some acorn shells on the ground? All right, this area had acorns this year or whatever else. And I start like trying to formulate a idea in my head why that is, and then maybe I start clustering more cameras around that elevation level, always keeping some on the fringes, but like I start like fine tuning specific spots based on that. But I run them typically almost always on scrapes at the beginning.
And then that makes sense in terms of just general inventory and how scrapes operate. I mean, those are some of the most fun locations.
And I will let me add to that a little bit. And if there's an area that doesn't have as much terrain where you're looking at elevation, then I'm looking at just different vegetation types. So like I might throw something on the edge of a clear cut or the edge of a swamp or something that has a scrape there, but looking at different type of vegetation edges to throw those cameras on. So that's kind of how I look at it there.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think the clear cut thing is like you're talking about the edge of them. When they're new, they have all that like that brand new food sources. Like maybe I see a lot of pokeberries and things like that.
Yep.
You running stuff on food sources like that in a clear cut.
I guess it would be not focused specifically on say that food source, but if I'm looking at like something like there, maybe an old log landing that might be on the internal spot that's just an opening that has all that stuff just there with it, as far as
that like invasive stuff or whatever.
All the vines and stuff that are growing up and some of the new grasses that are coming up gets a little more sunlight, and there seems to be a lot of travel that go through those. So those are areas that I will throw it on that are not just scrape oriented. But
is there any tips on trying to find where apple trees may be just based off the map, like on the different terrain types or where it might be higher or lower, or is it just kind of random?
No, so this is Pennsylvania specific, and I learned this from my grandfather when I was a kid, but a lot of Pennsylvania had old like towns and villages that were in the bottoms and like some of these creek drainages that would go up. And so I don't know how to find apple trees on the tops or the side hills very good, but like the bottoms, you can see places like where there might be they'll have springs that are coming up. There might be like a flatter bottom and maybe a little bit, you can see it's like a field. A lot of times there'll be apple trees there. So that's how I look at finding apple trees on the map, is like looking for where those old villages are. And it's like, if you're into like metal detecting or something, those are good places to go check out too.
Yeah.
Because there's typically old like foundations there or things you'll find.
Yeah.
Pretty cool.
And how often are they something like a crab apple? Are you finding that a lot too?
Yeah. I can't really tell the difference between those on the map, but when I get in there, you'll kind of see a mixture of it.
Yeah.
And a lot of times you'll get in there, the trees are just dead, like they're not even active anymore. But it's still pretty cool to be able to check out.
They make good looking branches too.
Yeah, they do. Yeah. And I mean, in areas that don't have like regular apples, the deer will eat those crab apples.
Yeah.
They'll smash them if they're available, and
there's a certain time of year they like those too, because right when they drop if they drop in the summer, they're pretty bitter.
Yeah.
But as like September comes in, they're pretty sweet. I know I used to have one in my backyard, and I used to just
I was just gonna say, because I know that from growing up having them in my yard, and when the deer would come in and hit them, and it seemed like after the first like frost in the fall there, it seems, I don't know if that's what makes them sweeter or not. I don't know that as far as fact, but it seems like that seems to be a trend.
I guess in those new cuts too, are you seeing them eat? You always get that maple growth like a year or two after those cuts are made. Are you seeing them eat maple leaves at a certain time of year?
I haven't noticed as much as far as the maple leaves. I've noticed the new growth of maple as far as even the twigs on them.
I find it right when they turn red, If they're yellow, they don't seem to eat them too much. But right when they turn red, they seem to just vacuum those maple leaves up in clear cuts like that.
Interesting. I haven't noticed that myself, but I'll have to pay attention to it. And I've tried to learn a little bit more about what some of that browse is, because a lot of times I'll just like know that they are feeding.
They're eating it.
and they're eating something, and I just kind of would walk away. But that's like been a goal of mine the last couple of years, and having a forestry buddy, he helps out a lot with that. Like when we shot a video last summer that I haven't released yet. That's all like breaking down cuts, like, and why, everyone always says in Pennsylvania that, oh, the foresters let all the cherry trees grow because they're worth the most value. And he's explained like that's not necessarily the case. First of all, they're not really worth that much anymore.
No.
But second of all, the deer don't like eating cherry saplings that are growing up, but they love the maple and the poplar and some of the other ones versus the cherries. So they just tend to overtake. And that's why, like, you'll see some management plans for clear cuts where they'll go through and they'll select cut it 1 year, and then they'll come back in about 3 to 5 years later and they'll respray it. One, because beech just seems to tear up and cover everything, take out the beech and try to create more diversity and let those seed trees try to take hold.
Right. And it depends on where you're at, but maple seems to be the worst. And then in your area, it seems to be a lot of beech, and a lot of other areas, it's aspen or birch.
Yeah.
We get that a lot, but they'll browse that. But once it gets above the browse line, I see them come back and cut those aspen back down, and then, to try to get whatever seeds to take over.
Yeah. And I think too, like, and even though, we're talking very specific to Pennsylvania, but I think this is relevant anywhere that this happens. It just might be a little bit of a different species of tree.
Right.
And
exactly.
That's kind of how I've looked at it when I go to different places of like, okay, yeah, like, and I know these bucks love to scrape under hemlocks and beech trees in my areas. Well, I go to West Virginia and it's like, okay, they kind of replaced it with autumn olive. Autumn olive bushes are like what they like to use. And so you just kind of you take the same concepts that you learn and then kind of apply it to different areas. But you can't be so narrow focused and looking for one specific thing. Kind of got to look at it a little creatively.
Well, and maple is the most invasive thing that in the whole country that comes back after a clear cut. I think per state, it's the highest number of invasive plants that there is maple.
I know a lot of areas where, like in the 80s, they would go and cut really heavily, and they wouldn't manage that forest. So now you just have a maple forest, and they're nice looking trees, but they provide no value for anything.
That's what they burn for the most is maple.
Yeah, because they're not very fire tolerant.
Yeah,
yeah.
Huh. Interesting.
So, what plans do you have for this upcoming year? I mean, obviously, one question I wanted to ask too, the Seek One guys, in the office, they're like, man, they're not going to like Pennsylvania. They come up and shoot a smasher. So how was that?
So it was good. It was awesome. I was kind of concerned when they said they wanted to come up and do it, because I was like, holy cow, like this is going to be difficult. And like, hey, we have like 3 days. You think that's possible? I was like, I don't know, man. Like this is going to be tough, but yeah, we'll give it a shot. And they were very just wide open to like the new experience. And like, for example, we were hanging out at camp and like Lee was just sitting in the corner with my dad, like picking his brain for hours upon hours and really trying to learn like why we were doing things or trying to do different things. And we went 2 days without really seeing much of anything for deer. Couple does, couple small bucks. And Drew's like, yeah, I saw it first drive. There was before the drive even started, walked up, there was a little 8-point bedded. I was like, you didn't shoot him? he's like, no, I just, it's kind of, barely legal type buck. And I said, yeah, no, I get it. It's up to you, but I'm just saying, let's look at your goals here and expectations. And if you have all season, like maybe you could try for something big. But
what time of the rifle season did you film that?
Second week.
Oh, that's tough.
So
everybody's already driven everything by then.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So kind of went, and then the spot that Lee ended up shooting that buck was a trusty old spot that my dad had that I shot one of my first bucks out of a long time ago. And yeah, it was really cool. And like it happened so picture perfect. We're starting, and this drive is interesting because it was like a hill and then there's like a thick bottom with a bunch of beaver ponds and stuff.
Yeah.
And the sitters sit on the other side, and the deer always bump out before you even get in that thick bottom. You get on top of that hill in the mornings and the wind's just blowing down right to them, and they just head out across well before you even get to them. So if you were a person walking through the woods,
You
you
never
wouldn't
know.
even know
Yeah.
that they were there. They just
Yeah.
they bust
Right.
out, and it worked out perfect, and ended up being a nice 3-year-old buck. Like I was very very happy for
Those
that.
like those brushy beaver bottoms like that are perfect areas to push deer into because they do feel comfortable. They'll just go and lay down in that sometimes.
Yeah, so that's it was really cool to get to have them there. And Lee was texting me afterwards because the part that didn't make the video was the one at the day after the day he shot his buck. It was the last day. We were going around looking at some new spots, and we came out after dark. No, it was the day he shot his buck. We came out after dark, and we were heading up, and we saw this buck standing in this camp yard. And it was a nice, like, 115-inch 8-point. He's like, holy cow, he's got to be living right there. And it was like a Seek 1 type spot, like camps around, small blocks, roads everywhere. And so the next morning we went in there to check it out, and I felt uncomfortable. There's roads around.
Yeah, I heard your
and
podcast with them. You're like, I don't like this.
I don't like this. Like, this isn't right. And Lee's like right at home, and he's like, oh man, I think he's living right here, Scrapes here. And we ended up trying pushing it out across the road, and the buck came out. He was living in there. And it just so happened 2 guys were driving down the road and got out to take a piss along the truck, and they came out and it like ran into them and then turned around and ran back the other direction. But it was funny. And then afterwards he's texting me, he's like, hey, I think I'm gonna come up, maybe do some scouting and maybe try to hunt that buck in archery. I'm like, what are you talking about? He's like, the one that was living behind those camps. I was like, holy cow.
That's their
He
forte.
will too. Like he's like, I'm gonna try to take what I know and apply it to your type of scenario. And I was like, that's a cool way of
Did you
looking
you
at
have to preach him the 150-yard safety zone in PA?
yeah exactly. No, it wasn't like we weren't hunting like right in the yard, but yeah.
That's awesome. So you were saying, what are your plans for this year? And then I had a tangent, but yeah, what do you have slated for this upcoming season?
So I'm not gonna do any spring hunts other than some turkey stuff. But for the fall, I'm going to Alaska in September to hunt moose, which
Wow.
is like
Nice.
a big dream of mine.
Is that a bucket list hunt?
Yeah, that's the top of it
Yeah.
at this point. And then so I'm going to do that. Then I'll come back, and for whitetails right now, I really just want to focus on Pennsylvania and West Virginia. Like last year I was running all over the place. I said I wasn't going to do it, and I did. And I always just feel like one step behind everything. Like
Yeah.
for me, I feel like to be even somewhat successful, I need to put time into something. And I've fallen in love with hunting Southern West Virginia
Mhm.
and want to continue to do that. And then Pennsylvania. And I am going to take a little break from whitetails in late October to head back to Alaska to hunt Sitka blacktail deer on Kodiak Island.
Oh, cool.
So yeah,
Very cool.
those are two really cool hunts. And I wasn't planning on doing 2 Alaska hunts in a year. Just it ended up happening, and it was like the moose hunt. If I didn't take it, it was like I'd probably have to wait another 5 or 6 years before I'd even have an opportunity to go again. So so that moose hunt's gonna be cool. It'll be a drop camp where the transporter just drops us off at a lake and then comes gets us in 12 days. So
Wow.
Now, did you need to do that guided where you're going in Alaska?
no.
Okay.
So no.
So I know there's some areas that you have to have a guide, and some areas that you don't.
Yeah,
right?
that's correct. Yep. But no, both those hunts will be unguided. The
Cool.
Sitka blacktail will be on a boat, sleeping on a boat, and they just drop us off on shore every day. We come back, we can fish at night and do whatever. So
That's cool.
That'll be fun.
Man, that's exciting.
Yeah.
Well, we got to get ready for the show. We got to switch Airbnbs here, so we'll wrap it up. I would say for anyone that hasn't found some of the stuff that you're putting out there, where should they go look?
Yeah, you can find anything at eastmeetswesthunt.com. Either look up Beau Martonik or East Meets West Hunt on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, all of those places. You can find all the information. So that's where I would look for me.
Awesome. Well, we appreciate it. It's always a pleasure to catch up, and look forward to following along this upcoming year too. Sounds like you got a really exciting season.
Yeah, it's fun. Thanks for having me on again. I can't believe it's been 3 years.
Yeah, honestly, I was talking about this earlier, but I want to say that was like 2 shows ago, but with the year with COVID, it's messing up the storytelling because it's like you got to add clarification. But anyhow, we appreciate it, Beau, and we're gonna head out.
Sounds good. See ya.